Hello, this is the Standing Committee on Health and Social Development. Today is Friday, July 16, 2021. First thing, can I get an adoption of the agenda? Okay, Michelle Beaton. I'd like to welcome our sitting members today. We have Zach Bell, Carla Bernard, Michelle Beaton, Sydney McEwen, Rob Henderson with us, and visiting or joining us is Peter Bevan-Baker and Trish Altez today for this important committee meeting. So today we're going to move right into our presentation, and we're going to get a briefing on the Indigenous reconciliation and anti-racism efforts in our province. So with us, I'll pass it over to our guests and they can introduce themselves just to put it in Hansard, and then continue on with the presentation, and then we'll have lots of time hopefully for questions in the committee. What we'll do is we'll prioritize the questions from the committee members first, and then have as many questions as we can from the visiting members, if that's okay. So I'll pass it over to our guests, and they can introduce themselves and continue on with the presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, my name is Christopher Gillis. I'm Deputy Minister of Priorities and Intergovernmental Affairs with Executive Council of the province of PEI. And today with me is Dr. Helen Kristmanson, who's the Director of Indigenous Relations, of the Indigenous Relations Secretariat with the province. So this morning we will be presenting on reconciliation and anti-racism work in the province. As I mentioned, I do have Dr. Helen Kristmanson here with me today. Dr. Kristmanson is an expert in archaeology with regards to Aboriginal rights. I'm very pleased to have her with me here this morning. In preparation for our presentation, we did realize that this is the first time in the 13 years history of the Indigenous Relations Secretariat that the Secretariat's been invited to committee. So we'd just like to thank you all very much for your interest in the Secretariat's work. And not only is that important today, given more recent events with the discovery of unmarked graves in connection to residential schools, but I think every day and certainly every year. And of course, the anti-racism work that the province has been doing and is kicking off is also incredibly important as well. Presentation this morning is broken up into two sections, the first being reconciliation, and then we'll move into the anti-racism work. Our objective this morning is to outline the truth and reconciliation work and anti-racism work being actioned within the government of PEI. And to create our presentation today, in order to ensure that we were addressing the needs and requests of the committee, we analyzed the Hansard actually from June 2nd, whenever the committee was discussing what it wished to know more about. To begin, we thought it was important as well to provide some context for Indigenous relations in the province, some of the key players, as well as some of the history associated with reconciliation specifically. So this slide outlines the Mi'kmaq First Nations here in Prince Edward Island. On the right, there's a very easy to follow flow chart or organizational chart, I should say, that Olney has on their website. So the Mi'kmaq are the Indigenous people of PEI, and we have two First Nations, the Abegwit First Nation and the Lennox Island First Nation. Both of those First Nations have independent or respective chiefs and councils, and then they come together to form the Abegwit Assembly of Councils. And then that council oversees three separate organizations, one being the Mi'kmaq Confederacy, the second being Olney, and then the third being their newest organization, the Abegwit Economic Development Corp. MCPEI, or also known as the Mi'kmaq Confederacy, provides programs and services to the two First Nations. Olney is the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative that was created not too long ago to focus specifically on Mi'kmaq rights and various initiatives in their own right, and then of course in relation with the province. And then the Abegwit Development is the economic development arm of the overall assembly, and as mentioned, that's their newest organization that's come into existence. Other organizations, we have the Native Council of PEI, which is a service organizations. Members may include diverse off-reserve and non-status individuals. They deliver programs and services for its membership, for example, skills and development, training, and housing support. And then there's also the Aboriginal Women's Association, which is a nonprofit member organization. They deliver programs and services to support Indigenous women specifically. The Executive Council Office is responsible for the Indigenous Relations Secretariat, so it does sit under Executive Council, as well as currently the priority around anti-racism work. The broader Executive Council, the work that we do ensures the province's interests are represented at the international, national, and regional level, so that would be intergovernmental work. It is also responsible for providing support to the Minister responsible for Acadian and Francophone Affairs and the Minister responsible for Indigenous Relations. The Executive Council provides strategic planning and policy guidance across government and administers Engage PEI, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit when we begin to look at the anti-racism work in government. The Indigenous Relations Secretariat itself, in its own right, is led by Dr. Kristmanson. There is a policy analyst within that organization, an archaeologist, an admin assistant, and then more recently an Indigenous Relations Coordinator and Reconciliation Coordinator. And those positions were added in recognition of the ongoing work and demands associated with the truth and reconciliation work, as well as the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls work. We're very excited in the Indigenous Relations Coordinator position to have someone many of you may know, Laurie Santage, who was most recently with the Mi'kmaq Confederacy as their Director of Justice and was acting Executive Director for some time. So she's joined our team, and we're very excited to have her professional and lived experience with us. The Indigenous Relations Secretariat within government, its role is a centralized resource, so it does operate as a subject matter expertise unit. It's a point of contact for the First Nations as well as other stakeholders, as well as interdepartmentally within government. So certainly as a horizontal support within government provides support to other departments and senior leadership. As mentioned, certainly a source of specialized information and policy guidance. There's a great deal of intergovernmental work that also happens within the Secretariat. So a lot of the work around the Truth and Reconciliation and MMIWG does happen at intergovernmental or FedProv, federal provincial tables. It's a funding vehicle, so we do provide direct funding to a number of organizations and work specifically, but the Secretariat does not administer any programs or services directly. And education and training, so it's a center of education and training for the public service specifically. Again, context is very important, so reconciliation, in terms of the formal definition from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report itself, defines it as the ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. And a critical part of this process involves repairing damaged trust by making apologies, providing individual and collective reparations, and following through with concrete actions that demonstrate real societal change. And certainly that's the definition we use within the work of the Indigenous Relations Secretariat when it comes to reconciliation. Also important when we are talking about Indigenous relations to recognize the very clear jurisdictional breakdown of responsibilities between the federal government and the provincial government and sort of who is responsible for what. So the federal government, of course, is responsible for the Constitution, and within Section 9124 of the Constitution, it designates the federal government as responsible for all matters regarding Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And of course, that definition is tightly connected to the Indian Act, which notably includes items that would normally fall under the jurisdiction of the provinces, for example, taxation, education, and elections. The federal government also maintains jurisdiction over reserved lands, and however, they have been slowly transferring some of these powers back to Indigenous governments. The provincial government are responsible, obviously, for administering provincial laws, which often do apply to First Nations people. However, they must not infringe upon matters within federal jurisdiction. And the provinces often provide programs and services to on-reserve and off-reserve populations. So in terms of the federal government's work, they are responsible for defining, for example, who is considered a status individual or which is defined or accepted as a First Nation as well. A very detailed timeline that I am not going to go through box by box this morning. However, important to illustrate the history of residential schools in Canada, and certainly when they began and where they ended. So the first residential school, or the version thereof, began in 1831, and the last school was closed in Canada in 1996. So when we are referring to residential schools, which really when that school finally closed, and is when reconciliation began, we are talking about specifically a 150-year history of the residential school system and the objectives of that system around specifically assimilation policy and the damage that has been done to the First Nations communities, and the historical and intergenerational trauma that the First Nations have experienced as a result of this. Throughout that history, churches, various churches or denominations were responsible for the administration of the system. In 1969 is whenever the government assumed direct control over residential schools. So Indigenous people today, as I mentioned, continue to experience the intergenerational trauma caused by the residential school system. It is the Constitution Act that placed the education of Indigenous children under the responsibility of the federal government. As I mentioned, in 1969 is when the federal government assumed control over the operation. Residential schools, as I mentioned, operated for 150 years, with the last one ending in 1996, which each of us here today certainly were around for. There were 139 schools across Canada. 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend these schools, and today about 80,000 of those 150,000 remain living, so a significant number still. And within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to actions, number 71 to 76 specifically addresses burial sites and missing children connected to the residential schools. So in a PEI context, the PEI Mi'kmaq are certainly experiencing the legacy of residential schools. We did not have any residential schools here in Prince Edward Island. However, that's not in no way intended to discount the experience, because we did have many children from Prince Edward Island, Indigenous children from PEI, that did attend residential schools in Shubenacadie. The exact number is not yet known, and that would be an access to records issue. There are 2,000 Mi'kmaq children within that were housed within that school. Shubenacadie itself was funded through Indian Affairs and the Catholic Church. Operations and curriculum were based on assimilationist policies, and that school was destroyed by fire in 1986. In the kind of contemporary or today context of what is happening with residential schools across the country, the federal government has responded by providing a $27 million fund for Indigenous communities and organizations, specifically around commemoration and research in relation to residential schools. So the Shubenacadie First Nation is using remote sensing to investigate the grounds of the former Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, and to date we don't yet know the outcome of that investigation and research. So as I mentioned, Truth and Reconciliation formally began in Canada in 1996 after the closing of the last residential school. That's when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report was released, and that report is effectively what paved the way for a very large class action lawsuit that was brought forward against the federal government that was eventually settled, and individuals that were party to that lawsuit did eventually receive financial payouts as settlements from the federal government. And in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed, with a final report coming from that commission in 2015. So over the duration of that time period, there were about 6,500 individual witness testimonies that were compiled as a result of a cross-country commission that interviewed individuals, and the final report is significant in terms of its depth, as well as capturing that lived experience from those individuals. The report itself includes 94 recommendations or calls to action directed at all Canadians to advance reconciliation with Indigenous people. And they are, the calls to action are organized under two different themes, one being legacy, the other being reconciliation. Legacy we can think of as traditionally sort of government services that individuals would receive, or particular areas of policy, child welfare, education, health, justice, language, and culture. Reconciliation, the second theme is significantly broader in terms of what it encompasses, and it does encompass church and religious institutions as well as private businesses. So again, given the jurisdictional breakdown and responsibility for First Nations and Indigenous relations, not all 94 calls to action fall under provincial jurisdiction or purview. However, there are about 33. The remainder of the calls do fall under other entities, as mentioned, the federal government as well as churches and businesses. So we've provided a grid here in terms of a breakdown in terms of the respective theme or area and the number of calls to action within provincial jurisdiction. And as I mentioned, there are 33. So PEI's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Status Report, the Secretariat has maintained an evergreen document detailing the work toward implementing the recommendations since that final report was released in 2015. 2018, the government committed to tabling a status update each year, which the government has done each year since then, and each of those reports is available on the government website. The first status report was tabled in 2019, and there have been 3 to date. The annual reports provide a regular update on the work being done in the departments, so all across government, to meet the recommendations. And the focus of our efforts has been on the calls to action, of course, that are within our jurisdiction. Here are some examples of some of the work that's being done within government to address each of the calls. So in terms of our overall progress towards implementation, all recommendations under its scope are contained within the report. And as I mentioned, they do fall under the respective department areas or policy areas. So some examples include under health, mental health and addiction staff going to both reserves. They've been involved directly in healing practices, including assistance with photo projects, and First Nations critical incident stress debrief model. In education, we've seen a revision of curriculum to include Indigenous history and perspectives, as well as our student well-being teams, once again, do work with both First Nations, and there's also transition coordinator at MCPEI to support Indigenous students moving from on to off reserve education. Another large piece of work that has flowed from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and has become its own standalone piece of work is the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls calls for justice. So you can see on the far right, there's an excerpt there from the TRC call to action number 41. So we call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal organizations to appoint a public inquiry into the causes of and remedies for the disproportionate victimization of Aboriginal women and girls. The inquiry's mandate would include investigation into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and links to intergenerational legacy of residential schools. So the national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus people is a direct result of the recommendation made in the TRC final report. So that inquiry began in September of 2016, and the final report was released in June of 2019. So from the province's perspective, to address these calls for justice, an interdepartmental working group was established that is ongoing today to coordinate that work interdepartmentally. Excuse me. An Indigenous working group was also created with representatives from both First Nations, MCPEI, NCPEI, and the Aboriginal Women's Association of PEI. There are common themes between the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the MMIWG report. There is overlap. Nevertheless, the province is addressing those. Going forward, we are looking at how best to maximize that work and possibly streamlining for reporting. So the working group that was struck to look at the recommendations flowing from the MIWG did meet regularly over the last year. They've identified priorities for government to guide its response to the calls for justice, Connected to these priorities, the province has also announced 4 initiatives that flowed from the recommendations of the working group: an Indigenous Health Navigator, annual MMIWG fund, so capacity dollars going to each of 5 organizations to work on the recommendations and provide advice back, mandatory cultural training for the public service, and an Indigenous housing funding stream. So the province is maximizing opportunities to implement recommendations that appear in both reports, and as I mentioned, we are looking at ways in which to streamline that reporting and the work associated with them. So moving forward in reconciliation, our work plan, the Indigenous Working Group and Interdepartmental Group will continue to meet on a regular basis. We will continue working with First Nations communities to ensure actions by the government are informed by the Indigenous Working Group. And IRS, or the Secretariat, will expand the scope of the Interdepartmental Working Group to identify opportunities to address recommendations that are thematically similar to both reports, and continue, of course, to provide regular updates to the legislature. Moving on now to the work of anti-racism, or the anti-racism work within Executive Council and government. There are 4 different areas I would like to take a look at this morning. The first being activities by the Public Service Commission, which of course is the objective Crown Corp that deals with human resources related issues for the provincial government, interdepartmental initiatives and community support, and then taking a look at the anti-racism policy advisor position and anti-racism advisory table. So within the Public Service Commission, although I, as Deputy Minister, am not responsible for the PSC, I'm grateful to our colleagues in that organization for providing us with this information and the important work they do around diversity, equity, and inclusion. A policy, diversity and inclusion policy, has been developed and implemented across the public service, and this aims to create a highly competent public service that is representative of the population we serve. And certainly we all recognize that the population of PEI has changed significantly over the last number of years. There are efforts within the public service to ensure that it is representative of those changes. There has been the creation of a diversity talent pool, so an inventory of qualified members from designated diversity groups that are registered with the PSC diversity program, and within those diversity groups also would include individuals from Indigenous communities. And the diversity employment program, so this facilitates successful screening and hiring of candidates from designated diversity groups, and the objective of that program really is to eliminate barriers and challenges that are in place for individuals from those respective groups when seeking employment, obviously, within the public service. The PSC diversity and inclusion learning initiatives include partnering with community groups to deliver special training sessions, enhance employee knowledge and expertise on diversity and inclusion, cultural competency and understanding. And sessions include unconscious bias to conscious inclusion. And this workshop is actually being developed into a webinar, which would be mandatory learning for all public servants and be part of the onboarding process for new employees. Valuing diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and cultural inclusion and multicultural education, once again within the public service. So interdepartmental initiatives and community support. So in November 2020, an interdepartmental task force for advancing gender equity and diversity was created within the public service. Their mandate is to provide an intersectional lens to government policies and programs and increase capacity across departments with regards to gender and diversity analysis. And they will be participating in a workshop next week, actually, specific to anti-racism. In early 2021, a citizen engagement steering committee was created, and this flowed from work that began last summer and last fall. Membership includes groups like the Black Cultural Society, BIPOC Usher, Chambers of Commerce, etc. Members' core strengths and background specialties include being a diversity specialist, backgrounds in agriculture from the Indigenous communities, sexual health, anti-racism, community navigation, immigration, international student support, and mental health. So it's a very diverse group of individuals. Input and feedback on anti-racism policy advisor position, roles and responsibilities. They've provided us with that already. And input on the anti-racism advisory table's role, makeup, and process. They've been hard at work the last few months. Funding and in-kind support to organizations advancing efforts towards anti-racism in our communities. So another instrument to support the work of anti-racism within our communities and also within government. And commitment to continued engagement and dialogue, obviously, with these respective communities and other stakeholders. And much of this work is in response to the petition that was tabled in the legislature in June of 2020 that sought that the government of PEI performs an extensive review of all provincial legislation and policies, applying an inclusive and racially focused lens with an immediate focus on education, health, healthcare, well-being, and job security. So much of this work is guided by the work or the mandate of that petition. The Anti-Racism Policy Advisor position is a position that has been created within government, and this flows from what's the word I'm looking for? From a proposal from the Black Cultural Society last fall. They came to us with 3 different requests. This was one of them. That position will be located within Executive Council, so it will report to the Deputy Clerk of Executive Council and Deputy Secretary to Cabinet. It will allow for cross-departmental collaboration. The position will focus on supporting the anti-racism advisory table and policy areas such as justice, health, and education. The position is being advertised now. It's open to the public. It was posted, I believe, earlier this week. So if you do know of anybody from within your respective networks that may be a good candidate for that position, I believe it'll be open for another 7 or 10 days. So please encourage them to apply. The role of the policy advisor will be similar to other policy advisor positions in government, but obviously specific to anti-racism. So they will provide anti-racism expertise on racialized communities, conduct research, data collection, and analysis on relevant policies and programs, support and provide expertise to the anti-racism advisory table, work closely with our senior leadership team and policy staff and other departments, conduct intersectional anti-racism analysis, advise government departments in the areas of strategic and operational planning, interdepartmental initiatives, program evaluation, et cetera, and provide advice and guidance on departmental executive council memos. So it's through that work that we will be able to address the concerns around legislation, regulation, and policy. So that individual sitting in executive council would be included in that process and be able to apply the anti-racism lens to the work of executive council. The Anti-Racism Advisory Table was another part of the proposal that was put forward by the Black Cultural Society. That table is being created now through Engage PEI. So Engage PEI is a program that oversees the recruitment of applicants and manages the appointment process for about 90 provincial government agencies, boards, and commissions. And there are 3 types of these ABCs: operational, adjudicative, regulatory, and advisory. And the anti-racism table will be an advisory table. The terms of reference for the advisory table are in the final stages of review by the Citizen Engagement Committee. The anti-racism table will identify ways and actions to address systemic racism in PEI, and it will further this mandate by making recommendations to the PEI government via the Premier, so it will report directly to the Premier. The table will receive administrative support from Executive Council through the Anti-Racism Policy Advisor, and applications will be open later this summer through Engage PEI for individuals to apply to that advisory body. That concludes my presentation. I'd like to open it up, obviously, for questions and discussion, and look forward to it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll start with Rob.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I guess obviously I represent one of the largest Indigenous populations in the province, and Lennox Island is within the boundaries of my riding. I think Sydney has the Abequate Scottsford location. But anyway, recently, I guess yesterday in the news, the newly appointed chief, or newly elected chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Roseanne Archibald, identified that the residential schools, these were crime scenes. And you know, and I've had the opportunity to discuss some of these issues with some of my constituents, and I would share that opinion or view. What is the province's view on these situations, or especially in the situation of Shubenacadie? And you know, what is the province doing to try to come to some sort of a conclusion to determine whether these were crime scenes or not?
Pardon? Do you want me to answer? Or? Yeah, it's okay. Go ahead, and I can follow.
I think the residential schools run at the jurisdiction of the federal government, and certainly that would be within their jurisdiction to proceed on whatever the recommendation is or whatever the merits and the evidence of each situation outlines. Our position within the province, of course, is that we will support our First Nations and whatever is needed for them to heal from the intergenerational trauma that they're experiencing as a result of either individual or direct or familial experiences within the residential school system.
Rob?
But, so I'm going with some assumptions then that you've already had some discussions with some of the survivors and some of the people involved, say from Lennox Island, that were involved in Shubenacadie. And do you not get that same impression that there is probably a situation that's occurred to residents of Prince Edward Island that were of a criminal nature?
Our conversations are ongoing, with the First Nations, but whether it be formally or informally, and as outlined in, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission flows directly from the experience of the residential schools, and the province has responded to many of those calls to action. And again, if either of the First Nations, whether it be Abiguit or Lennox came forward looking for support around their response to recent revelations, but of course it's all, this has also been going on. They know more than anyone for generations, and we are there to support them on that.
Rob?
So it would take one of our chiefs to ask for the province of PEI to call for an investigation into these crime scenes? Or? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is what's it take? What's the role of the province here? I mean, you have an Indigenous Secretariat that I would assume is to hope to support our Indigenous people in the province of Prince Edward Island. And if crimes occurred to our residents today or in the past, it would seem logical that we would be calling for some justice. And so I guess I'm trying to determine, as a representative from that area, what's it take for you to interact and make that request?
So, okay, understood. Thank you for clarifying. I would say that much of the trauma that's been experienced to date by the First Nations is a result of paternalistic and colonial style intervention by our governments, provincial and federal. And I don't think that it would be our role to take yet today a paternalistic approach to what we think the First Nations need in order to heal from this experience, and that it is not our trauma to try and address directly, rather to work with the First Nations around what they believe and when they believe, more importantly. So it's also a timing issue, whether or not the community is ready to address it and what they need to address that. And we would take our cues from them, recognizing again that a paternalistic approach is not going to we wouldn't see that as being beneficial, and obviously, if we did, we'd be short-sighted in terms of not really learning from what history we believe has taught us to date.
Rob?
I guess I would argue that the highest elected Indigenous chief in the land calling to the crime scene would be basically calling out that to get that support. You'd mentioned that you don't have a sense of how many people from Prince Edward Island actually attended the residential schools in Shubenacadie. And you said there may be an issue about trying to get that information. What's it take for us to get that information, and how many children were forced to enroll in that particular school over the years? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can answer. And just to sort of follow up on a bit of what the deputy was saying, we have given space to the subject with our Indigenous Working Group. So we've been meeting with the Indigenous Working Group every other month for over a year now, and in the wake of the Kamloops tragedy, we dedicated specific time to hear from the Indigenous representatives. In fact, we dedicated our entire 3-hour meeting to it last time, which spilled over an extra hour. And we're very mindful of the fact that this is a long legacy in Canada and has left deep impacts on Mi'kmaq and Indigenous society and PEI and Indigenous society all across Canada. And we understand that this has to unfold on their terms. And during our conversations with the Indigenous Working Group, we heard stories, we heard points of view, and the message to us really is we're going to get to that. You know, even the invitation to give space to discuss this can act as a trigger, and it did. And we have to be very careful about how we approach this. And as the Deputy Minister said, we defer to the leadership. Each of the representatives of our Indigenous Working Group were appointed by their leadership, so by Chief Bernard, by Chief Gould, and by the leaders of the Indigenous organizations. We now have, as the Deputy mentioned, we have Laurie Santonge working with us, and she's going to be taking a leading role in the missing and murdered and reconciliation work. She brings a very specialized knowledge and experience to this role. She's acting as in an advisory capacity to us in this role, one that we wouldn't have. She brings the Indigenous voice to our shop. So just to say that, you know, we take this very seriously, and we will proceed under the guidance of the Indigenous leadership, and that certainly the conversation has already started.
Rob?
Do you have any sense, though, when that, so we're talking another year later, or?
Oh, sorry, I was one at a time here. Yeah, as I said, you know, we will work at the pace of the PEI First Nations and Indigenous community on this. I can imagine the amount of work and preparation on their part to prepare people to have these conversations, and having been involved in the missing and murdered file for many, many years, it's clear that, you know, we don't want to ask people to tell their stories for the sake of telling their stories. We don't want to create conditions for triggering. It's really, really important that the Indigenous community and the PEI First Nations set the pace and set the agenda for this.
Okay, let's ask one more question, then, just on a little bit different. So in Prince Edward Island, you know, as a government, we're certainly probably trying to define, you know, what Indigenous self-government actually means. And from what I have been reading on this, it seems like there's a number of different interpretations of that. But what is our government interpreting as, you know, and how we would define Indigenous self-government in Prince Edward Island to the local Indigenous people here, and just to kind of get a sense of what direction we're going in here.
I'll maybe take the first part, and then Helen can take the second part. So once again, it wouldn't be for us to define what self-governance looks like for the Indigenous communities. Rather, that needs to be a definition that's created within those communities for what their needs are specifically, and then obviously to engage with the province and the federal government to make that a reality. I'll now defer to Dr. Kristmanson to speak about the partnership agreement that we have in place.
You've probably heard about the framework agreement, the Tripartite framework agreement that we signed in 2019, and that was signed with the PEI First Nations, so Lennox Island and Abbotsford First Nation, as represented now by Ulnoe, which is the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, and also we signed that with Canada. And that is, the agreement provides a stable forum for our relationship and our dialogue. It provides an avenue for reconciliation, and the long-term sort of vision of the agreement is an accord which brings clarity to Aboriginal rights in PEI, and also sets the stage for self-government in PEI. And if you're familiar with this process in Canada, you know it's a very long and comprehensive and complex process that involves three parties, which all have different roles to play in the process. So we meet with the parties every 6 to 8 weeks to have these conversations. Well, I know that Ulnoe has done a tremendous amount of work since its inception on readying the community, the Mi'kmaq community, to participate in these discussions. There's a lot of groundwork to be done in terms of thinking in the future about what self-government looks like, and it will be unique in every province and territory. So the PEI Mi'kmaq are doing a lot of hard work to get ready for those conversations, and again, it's unfolding as it does at the discussion table.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for being here today and your presentation. I have a million questions, but I'm going to try to condense them a little bit. So I was going through the Truth and Reconciliation report and recommendation number 4. So I'll just read it really quickly, but we call upon the federal government to enact Aboriginal child welfare legislation that establishes national standards for Aboriginal child apprehension and custody cases, and includes principles that, and then it kind of explains those principles. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the Child Protection Act review that is currently happening and how that will benefit or potentially benefit our Indigenous communities in PEI.
Well, it's not particularly in my purview, to talk about this as the Director of Indigenous Relations, but I do understand that with the Act in place, the Child Protection Services in the province has had a long relationship with the PEI First Nations when it comes to child protection services. Right now, there's an internal team in the department that consists of various individuals with specialized knowledge and specialized qualifications. They work directly with the First Nations. So, for instance, in case of a child coming into care, the province works directly with the First Nations leadership, and that is actually legislated that they're required to do that. And then if the First Nations or Indigenous child is from another jurisdiction in Canada, the province makes the effort to reach out to the parent organization, if it's a band or whatever organization it is, to work with them on that. And then there's a long-standing relationship through the PRIDE program between the department and the Mi'kmaq since 2005 to collaborate to provide supports for families and parents and children in the province.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. And one of, at the vigil for the first 215 children that were found in unmarked graves, Chief Darlene Bernard had compared our current child protection to a modern-day residential school, and that has stuck with me profoundly. So I'm wondering, I guess you probably don't have numbers on how many Indigenous children are in care in the province right now. No? Okay. I'm wondering so you mentioned that the province is working with Indigenous communities and then if there's a child that is from another Indigenous community outside of the province, that they work with them. Are there actually Indigenous people in the roles in government to make these decisions? So more than just conversations with, and taking their recommendations, are there actually Indigenous people in government helping to lead this?
So I can answer the first part, and then Helen can answer the next. So part of the challenge would be around self-identification within government. So we don't necessarily know who is Indigenous and who isn't. We can prioritize positions, as we've done in the Secretariat, to provide preference to somebody who self-identifies. But we wouldn't be able to report specifically on those exact numbers. I'll now defer to Helen on the consultation and how that works in terms of any issue that's related to an Indigenous child and the connection that's made with the respective communities to ensure that voice, that cultural awareness is taken into consideration in each situation.
I don't really think I have anything to add to that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's all right.
Carla?
My last question?
Sure.
Or do I get one more?
Oh, you can have a couple more.
Okay, great. I'm
got
wondering,
time.
who's overseeing the review
Okay.
of the child protection? Who's overseeing the child protection services review?
Yeah, we wouldn't
We're not that
directly, just given our work, but happy to take a look into it, Carla, and get back to you with that answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm just going to continue with the child protection review for the moment. But branching off a little bit, has government given any consideration to the immense benefits that midwifery services dedicated to Indigenous communities could have for Indigenous children and their families? Is that something that you've discussed?
So once again, it would be specific to the work in the Department of Health. It's not something that we've addressed directly. It's not to say it hasn't been. Again, happy to look into it and come back to you with an answer.
I guess probably my next question on the 1,000 first days would be the same thing, so I'll throw that one out there for now. And then I'll recalibrate my questions. I'll stop for now
Sure.
there, Chair. Yeah, thank you.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here and your presentation. I'm just going to quickly do a follow-up from what Robbie was asking around criminal investigations. So is it your opinion, I guess, do you expect the federal Crown, who I'll remind you, funded the policy, supported the policy, implemented the policy, is it your expectation that they will do prosecution at the time when we get there? Or will the province actually, with our own Crown, understanding that Islanders were impacted by this, take steps towards prosecution?
So what I can say is that certainly in any like federal provincial meeting or meeting that we've had with the federal Crown, this hasn't yet been an item for discussion. So it would be premature for me to comment on what we thought they may or may not do, and it wouldn't really be my role here now. I mean, obviously, as I said, we will support if and where we can when it comes to whatever issue the First Nations are facing.
Sure.
Okay, I'd just like to point out that absolutely the province can actually do within the own scope of our jurisdiction here in the province that there is the ability and the means to do that, and I just would like to point that out. So I'm kind of confused by some of the answers that my colleague Carla just received. So my understanding of the Secretariat is that you are following the recommendations, the calls to action, and the actions out of both reports, and you're consolidating the information and you are presenting them in a report. But have you been part of identifying what needs to happen within each department under each recommendation in order to identify whether we've actually met the requirements and the recommendations?
The Secretariat, in slide 8, we sort of gave the role and responsibility of the Secretariat. And while we have a coordinating committee to help steer the work of the Interdepartmental Working Group and the Indigenous Working Group, the Indigenous Relations Secretariat doesn't have the authority to set priorities in other departments. So our role really is to, when the TRC report first came out in 2015, the first thing we did was say, okay, let's have a look at what's already going on in government, because government hadn't waited for a report to come out to act on Indigenous matters. There was already a lot going on in government, and so the objective was to take stock of what was going on and keep an evergreen document, keep in touch with departments. In a perfect world, we would be completely plugged into everything that's going on everywhere, but we're a small shop, and we do our best to keep track of that. But we don't have the authority to set priorities in other departments.
Michelle?
Thanks, Chair. You might not have the authority to set priorities. However, once you identify what actions are required, then an action plan should be formulated as to what actions will be taken in order to address the recommendation to ensure that the recommendation is fully met. And is that a role that the Secretariat is taking? So having the departments identify the specific actions, and then you following up and ensuring that those actions are actually being implemented.
We would. By virtue of the yearly status report. So, you know, although conversations occur obviously throughout the year and there are regular meetings interdepartmentally on this work, but those departments would report back to us on what progress is being done, and then we would report it out through our annual report.
Michelle?
One more follow-up on that, and then I'll let somebody else go, Chair. So, have you received action plans from each of the departments that these calls to action have implemented, or sorry, recommended to identify what each department will be doing? And do you have a scorecard per se of how each of those ones are and where they are in the process of implementation?
So again, you know, we work with the respective departments. It's up to them to organize their work and how they want to manage that as an internal tool, like an action plan. You know, we're comfortable with the reports that we're given from the departments around the progress they're making on the commitments that they've been made or that they have made.
One final statement, but the answers is to like specific actions within areas, for instance, updates to the Child Protection Act, for instance. You don't seem to have an answer as to where that progress is. So if you are following the action plan that the department has provided you, as you say, you are comfortable with what they have provided as actions, I would expect that that would be something that you would be providing as tracking methods of these recommendations to show the province actual progress. I'm not seeing that true follow through on each recommendation of the actions that need to happen in order to say that you have met that recommendation. Anyway, I'll let somebody else go. Chair, thanks.
Thank you. Sydney?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Christopher and Heather, Helen, sorry, for coming in. I think it's you know, pretty important that we acknowledge the immense leadership and character that both Chief Darlene Bernard and Chief Junior Go have shown over obviously over the past number of years, but especially in the past few months. It's been amazing to hear them be leaders in our province and in their communities as well. I know their communities appreciate it as well. In 2019, early 2019, the province signed a tripartite agreement with the federal government, the province, and with our First Nation leaders. And you know, at that time, and I'll just quote, I guess, from that release, but in particular, the framework agreement outlines subject matters and areas of importance for the Mi'kmaq, establishes a process to facilitate efficient and timely discussions, and reaffirms parties' commitment to a process for reconciling and respecting the Mi'kmaq of Prince Edward Island's Aboriginal and treaty rights. I bring this up with regards to I'll say the health area in our First Nations, and in my consultation with you know, Edward First Nations in particular, but in all First Nations, when they go to the table, you know, nation to nation, certainly, you know, chief to premier, that type of thing, that respect is there, and they really appreciate it. And there's a different sense when the leadership of, say, an example in health, go to leadership in health of the province. And I know that would be new, for certain within the bureaucracy. But it's identified as a problem, and I'm wondering, as far as your office is concerned, what we can be doing to strengthen that when they go to those meetings, that it truly is that tripartite agreement, it's nation to nation. It's not just checking a box that someone was invited. Have you heard this in any areas? I've heard it in health, but I'm just curious to your response to that.
I just want to clarify. So you mean if like officials or staff from the Provincial Department of Health go out to Abbotsford to meet with their staff who are involved in health programming?
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa. Okay.
The decisions around health and the allocation of resources, that negotiation between our First Nations, between the federal government and the province, with regards to health services especially. Have you heard that back at all?
I'm not really sure I understand your question. I'm sorry, if you could reframe it a bit.
Right, so the tripartite agreement really outlined a process and outlined that consultation that when when our leaders meet, it really is nation to nation to nation, right? You have our federal representatives, our senior, our premier, and our chiefs. They're all on a tripartite equal basis, right? It's leader to leader. So when our leadership in each of our areas come to meet as well, there was a sense that acknowledgement wasn't there as well. So especially with that agreement that this is the way we'll be going forward. So I'm just curious to know, with these recommendations, especially in health, have you heard that, or is there any, for example, in education, right? Like having people trained, curriculum. You had mentioned in the report, it also says about staff and health being trained as well. Are you getting that feedback that that's changing, that's now recognition that this just isn't, I need to invite someone from First Nations to a meeting, it's we're negotiating together for those services, equal services?
So I think I can answer that. So I think there's a couple of things that happen around relationships and negotiations. So the tripartite agreement is a very, very formal agreement process. It's very long term. The issues I think you're referring to around healthcare really wouldn't be discussed at that table in that context. It would be, again, it would be, much longer term. So our role as kind of a centralized coordinating body, providing advice and guidance, as Helen said, we do our very best to be involved in all of the work possible. But that is also dependent upon kind of the size of government, the scope, the comfort of the individuals, et cetera. So we aren't involved in every corner of the work that's happening, but we do have a mandate around training and education. And so through that instrument, we certainly work and do our very best to ensure that that employees in the province understand the significance of the relationship, the importance of the relationship. We're not talking about sort of your run-of-the-mill public consultation whenever we meet with our First Nations. As you say, it's nation to nation. There's a historical relationship there that needs to be understood and contextualized. So certainly even in my short time in this role, I've been involved in conversations like that with departmental staff. So that's certainly a priority for us and something that we are focused on a regular basis, that officials to official work. I think the other thing, and I was thinking of this when I was reflecting on the presentation, is that this is all very formal, and we're talking about action plans, we're talking about responses and tabling annual reports, but there's also an incredibly informal relationship between the province and the First Nations that involves texting and phone calls and sort of, hey, can you help us with this? Well, yeah, for sure, let me see what I can do and I'll get back to you. There's a lot of that happens that's well outside the defined scope of what we've referring to here, and at no point would we, I know you're quite close with Abbotsford First Nations, and we recently helped them with a secondment from our finance staff to help build capacity for their finance within their finance department. And similarly, they've recently come with a request for a secondment from somebody from tourism to help them build up and implement their strategic plan with regards to tourism, which we're facilitating and looking at providing some funding, et cetera. So that wouldn't be something that we would go to the TRC report and say, okay, well, which call to action does that fall under? That's really, there's a genuine desire there to do what's best. So I think I'm not sure if that addresses your answer directly. And if you want to talk about the tripartite agreement, I would certainly defer to Dr. Kristmanson on that, and that being a much more formal, long-term agreement.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. No, and I appreciate that. I'm certainly not trying to leave the impression that the relationship is not good. It's been, I would argue, better than ever, and especially those types of things, right? And I would argue that's because of a number of things, but the tripartite agreement that shows that this is it's much more on a nation to nation basis, and those types of relationships come from that. I raised it in health specifically because if the province provides some services to for example Abbotsford First Nations on reserve, and it's probably similar to when our province as a small jurisdiction in the federal scheme is looking for resources to get things, and then there's probably a sense of this is your size, do you really need that much? And I would compare that to somewhere like Abbotsford, where perhaps the feeling is that we also have to provide healthcare services for Prince Edward Island, and they're looking for services from the province as well, especially on reserve. And I think it's that mindset, it's that training, it's that experience to know that, do you have to look at it through a First Nation lens? So when you're providing that on reserve, we're actually helping our provincial system as well, right? You're diverting people, and you also have First Nations helping First Nations as well. And the reason I raise this is, going to one of the recommendations that came back in the update or the update report. Under the health, wellness, and healing section, health and wellness services, and then this comes from the working group, sorry. Health and wellness services for Indigenous people that address all forms of trauma and either Indigenous-led or in partnership with Indigenous communities. And I think it's really important, rather than some of the racism that our First Nations would experience when they go access healthcare services in our province, which we know and we acknowledge. When they're accessing those healthcare services in their own community, it's quite different, and you have people that are showing it. So I guess that's my go from high level down to the local level, where that's really important locally. And I'm wondering, in respect to that, to the health and wellness and healing recommendations, if that, that training, that mindset, that mentorship within Department of Health keeps being pushed, so that we can access those services, and that when we're making the decisions about, okay, that's a lot of resources to put on our First Nations, it's actually really, really worth it. And I guess that's my point, and I think I'm hoping that, coming from the Indigenous Secretariat side of things, that's pushed when you do have those meetings with health and you're looking for their work plans and their options. So I guess that's trying to see where I'm coming from on that.
Comments? Yeah.
Certainly, again, the conversations, the work that we do with the Department of Health, and when it comes to First Nations, that education, cultural awareness component is key and front and center. I haven't heard of anything specific to that. I don't know if you have, Helen, but if there's something specific that we can discuss offline, or if there's someone from the First Nations that needs to reach out, by all means, encourage them to do that, and we'll do our level best to address the concern.
Chair?
For Chair Sydney?
Yeah, and just to finish, like you say, it's because you see these recommendations in there, and I think it's that broader expectation that, it's not just putting money here, putting money there. It's acknowledging the racism that does happen within our system, and showing that, those resources might be better off. Even the limited resources that we have for everywhere might be better off there. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Sid. Trish?
Thank you, Chair. Could you tell me a little bit about what the province is doing to support Indigenous economic development, so including access to capital for Indigenous businesses?
Well, I can answer that to some extent. In PEI, as elsewhere in the country, we have the duty to consult process, which engages us in dialogue with the First Nations, and the basis for that is reconciliation, and the reconciliation of Aboriginal rights and interests with settler interests. And we like to we have the constitutional and legal obligation to enter into a consultation process, but we like to make it much more than that if we can, and use the process to identify opportunities for economic development. There are some examples where we and the Mi'kmaq have agreed to sort of put a pause on consultation and chase down an opportunity to work on together. I don't think I'm free here to just discuss those details right now because they're in negotiation, but all that to say that, we want to, while we want to uphold the honor of the Crown in our consultation process, we also want to use it to seek opportunities for economic development, and there are various initiatives in that area. And also, I know that the province also has a wage subsidy program to connect Indigenous people with the workforce, in particular right now in the area of crafts and tourism and agriculture. We also are working with Abogwit First Nation on a very specific one, and Deputy might have a bit more information on that than I do, but not to put you on the spot there, but you probably have a bit more than I do. So all that to say, we also have the framework agreement process, which is another avenue for us to look for economic development opportunities. in our conversation with Alnue, the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, who are representing the First Nations. And we also have different initiatives in the works with each First Nation, again, that are still in the works, and I'm probably not free to discuss those here, but all to say that, yes, absolutely, that's a priority.
Trish? Oops, sorry.
Just add as well, I mean, wealth-generating projects of any sort are certainly a priority. It was mentioned in the speech from the throne with regards to our relationship with the First Nations, and it's a top of mind in any meeting we have. Helen and I met with Alnue last week. It was a bit of a, just kind of a touch base meeting, if you will, and you know, that was top of mind around wealth-generating projects, whatever the First Nations determine or what they want to focus on.
Trish?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that. It would be interesting to know about opportunities for, let's say, Indigenous entrepreneurs who have ideas and, you know, could value some additional support to get those projects off the ground. So I think it's great that there are ongoing discussions with Alnue, and that there's certainly an openness to work together on economic growth and wealth growing projects. Finding ways to support Indigenous, you know, entrepreneurs as well, I think would be certainly a worthwhile and important endeavor. Additionally, I'm wondering about the work to include Indigenous voices in governance structures. So thinking about, you know, like the Health PEI board or other boards or governance structures, you know, what initiatives are underway to include more Indigenous voices in our governance?
So when I presented on the slide with regards to the Public Service Commission and spoke to the diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, I think that would fall under there, as mentioned, under certain designation groups, including Indigenous individuals. They would fall under that designated group, and therefore that policy, which applies to all of the work within the public service, including Engage PEI.
Trish?
And have you been able to measure the success or not of that policy in engaging Indigenous Islanders as well as other diverse groups in governance?
That's a good question that I don't have the answer to. Again, happy to look into it and bring it back to you. What I would say is that you know, that policy exists without a doubt, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a very formal and informal relationship that happens with First Nations as well, and those voices are included in I'd say almost every single decision when it comes to services or what have you that impact those communities.
Trish?
Okay, yeah, so I think it's you know, it's certainly important to be able to monitor whether a policy is successful in achieving its goals, right? So I think I would certainly be interested to find out more about the evaluation of that policy, because it's, you know, you certainly don't want a policy that's just, you know, nothing more than a piece of paper. It needs to actually be achieving the goals of increasing diversity within our governance structures. I'd like to also ask about what strides are being made to reduce income disparities between white and racialized Islanders across all sectors.
Are you referring to like just specific government initiatives, government programs?
Yes. What initiatives is government taking to reduce the income disparities?
Again, I would need to look into that and come back to you. That's not something that falls directly under my purview. It wouldn't be for me to mention or to respond to on behalf of another government department. But happy to look into it and bring an answer back to you.
Trish?
Yeah, no, I do believe it really would be under the purview of what we're discussing today, certainly in terms of anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion. So, you know, I would also like to know more about that, and I hope that it is something that is being looked at by government. Just one last question. I'm wondering about if you can give any sort of specific examples of legislation or regulations or policy that you're working on currently, specifically legislation and regulations to increase diversity and inclusion in just specific examples would be helpful.
Sure. So as I mentioned in my presentation, we currently are hiring for an anti-racism policy advisor position, which is certainly a significant change and in addition to the executive council team, and that will contribute, I think, significantly to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but specifically through an anti-racism lens that work of government does. As I mentioned, through executive council, that is where legislation, regulations, and larger government policy would flow. As well as the anti-racism advisory table, which is constructed specifically to provide advice back to government on the needs and challenges and supports required from that community.
Just one quick
Trish?
follow-up. So, it is good to hear that there's an anti-racism policy advisor and the anti-racism table, that is work that's underway. So am I to understand then that in terms of legislative or regulation changes, it's all kind of on hold until those pieces are in place? Is there nothing that's been identified so far to work on and make some changes?
Again, in terms of legislation and regulation that would fall under my purview, there's very little, quite frankly, and in terms of what the departments are doing, that work is ongoing. And I believe as they're creating their legislative and regulatory, work plans for the next session, that is taken into consideration.
Peter?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for being here this morning. It certainly feels like we're at a critical moment in time when it comes to the conversation around Indigenous issues and anti-racism as well. And you, right off the bat, Christopher, you mentioned that it's the first time you've been invited to a standing committee in 13 years. That in itself is emblematic of what I've just said. And the Land Matters report, for example, that was issued yesterday, covered a lot of the same ground as many of the reports that we've previously had on land matters, except this time there was a very specific recommendation, one of the 13, regarding inclusion of Aboriginal Indigenous voices as we go forward. So things are definitely moving, and I realize we're at the very beginning of this sort of hinge moment. And I'm wondering whether you would agree with the statement that in order for this to be something which is truly sort of systemic, that education is going to be a very fundamental part of making sure that the conversation we have is something that produces generational change.
I believe we both agree with that. Yes, absolutely. Education certainly is the key to any kind of progress, evolution, or change. And we indicated in our presentation that a role of the Secretariat specifically is around education and training.
That too, if you like. A couple of things that I'd add to that. In our work with the Indigenous Working Group, we've had a lot of brainstorming sessions with them. Their role is to help government in decision-making and setting priorities. And one of the most common themes that's come from the Indigenous Working Group is education, and trying to achieve the intersubjective kind of knowledge and understanding that we need in society to advance reconciliation. And so we heard that loud and clear, and we completely agree. And that's why, as one of our initiatives when we tabled our report this spring, was to offer to make our cultural awareness training compulsory for all provincial civil servants. And I can share a little anecdote with you, I think, to comment on your observation about how reconciliation has just become so familiar to all of us now in society, but it does require long-term vision and short-term actions and gains. But when we first started the cultural awareness training, it was around 2009, I think, and at the time, the Mi'kmaq Confederacy was offering I think it was about a 13-part series at Seniors College. And actually, I was one of the presenters. It was before I even worked for government. And I would go and present on archaeology. And then when I came to government, I thought, wow, what a great idea to bring this to government. So we started together, and we would have lunch and learn, the brown bag lunch series, and we'd get a handful of people. And that was back around 2009. Today, it's a 3-module certificate course. We get more people than we can accommodate, and I think Last time we had over 100 people and a waiting list. And I think that's a real testament to your observation about how society is taking notice, and hopefully all of us looking for the collective shift in society towards a post-colonial era.
Peter?
I really appreciate both of your answers, and I realize it was a sort of slightly vague question, but the reason I asked it, and Helen, you just sort of alluded to it there, that we need to have a long-term vision, but we need to make short-term decisions now, and the decisions we make now will influence that long-term, because in my many of my discussions with islanders, I'm surprised and rather shocked at the level of knowledge that most islanders have on the relevance of the peace and friendship treaties, for example. And I think there's a real place, particularly in our education system, to turn that around. And I realize that will take some time for that to happen. The specific call to action that I'd like to reference is number 62, which, and many of the calls to action, of course, are related to the federal level of government, but this one is specific to provincial, and it says, we call upon the federal, provincial and territorial governments in consultation and in collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples and educators to establish a senior level position, establish senior level positions in government at the assistant deputy level minister or higher, dedicated to Aboriginal content in education. That to me seems like a really seminal part of creating this structure within our education system, which is going to have long-term impacts. And I'm wondering where you are with that particular call to action, specifically because it does say a provincial government.
So there's certainly, as we provided in the presentation, there's been a revision of curriculum to include more Indigenous information, cultural sensitivity, et cetera. Specific to that call around appointing a position, I don't have the information to comment on that right now. But once again, we'll be happy to look into it and provide information back.
Peter?
Thank you. We've heard that a lot, Christopher, and I understand that we're talking about cross-departmental concerns here. But I'm wondering who within government, if it's not you, would be proactively advocating for such a position, and is that something that you're doing?
It is not me that makes the decision around senior staffing decisions, but certainly, in the process of creating our annual report and revising the calls to action, we review all of them that are relevant to us and provide information to within the report and back to the legislature.
Can I ask you then where you imagine that process, that impetus, the catalyst to get that moving would come from within government?
Well, again, it would depend on the decision makers of that. I mean, senior level positions are appointed through executive council, and so it would fall to that body to make those appointments.
Peter?
So do you see the Indigenous Relations Secretariat having any role in implementing the calls to action other than writing the report each year?
Well, again, as we outlined in the presentation, we are coordinating, collaborative body. We attempt to be certainly as influential as we can across governments or across government departments. We're a source of expertise. We're a source of policy guidance. But when it comes to the actual work and the legislative or regulatory work required for some of this work, it does fall under the respective departments. We work closely with them on that work, but our role specifically is not to implement those programs or those changes specifically.
Peter?
Thanks again, Chair. We've spent a lot of time on Indigenous issues, of course, with good reason. We haven't really spoken much about anti-racism, and I just want to ask one particular question on that. And I realize that the anti-racism policy advisor position is currently being advertised and will be filled shortly, and that the table is in the process of being developed. But I did notice on the presentation that there was a call from BIPOC Usher in the last round of presentations for budget presentations for funding for several positions. And I noted on your presentation there was the call for funding and in-kind support is how it was, and the response to that from your Secretariat was a commitment to continued engagement and dialogue, which is not at all the same thing as a commitment to funding. And I'm wondering where you sit with that particular request that came from BIPOC Usher for funding for positions within government.
Yeah, you're right, they're not the same. So there are individual bullets around additional work that we're doing, including that ongoing dialogue piece. So we're in discussion right now with BIPOC Usher and finalizing their funding based on the request that they made to us.
More is that?
One very quick follow-up, Chair, to that. So I'm really glad to hear that. And presumably, given the fact that you're in ongoing conversations now, you won't be able to tell us this, but I believe that the request was for 4 positions from BIPOC Usher. Can you give us any indication as to whether all of those will be established, maybe some of them, or?
I think some of them definitely will be, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And I think they're in discussions right now with the funding department around what the needs are, specifically what the organization is going to look like, et cetera. But there's definitely a funding commitment made to them. It's just a matter now of finalizing what those positions are and finalizing that agreement.
Great to hear.
Yeah.
Rob?
Just to get back to the residential school issue a little bit more here, I'm trying to get a sense of this Indigenous Secretariat and the role that and I think the Premier's the minister responsible for it, but have you made any overtures or correspondences or discussions with, say, the Catholic Church regarding the issues about fulfilling their obligations to, I think some of the things that have been identified, one was that their agreed upon compensation that they were willing to provide has not happened. As well as there has been no apology, to my knowledge, that has come from that specific or that church specifically, or even to get some sense of how many Islanders did go to residential schools in Shubenacadie. So can you give me any briefing on what has been done by either the Indigenous Secretariat or the Premier?
In terms of getting, numbers and information about the children who went to the schools, it does require research, into the Indian agents' records and things like that. We'd have to get in touch with a professional historian to track down that information. I do have a colleague working for the federal government who's done some work on this, and on Shubenacadie actually, and she touched upon some of the PEI information, but her report wasn't on the PEI residents, but she did say that, there are records there. There wasn't a lot for PEI that she encountered, but that doesn't mean that, it's not worth researching. So that work can be done. And again, the Indigenous population has been studied a lot, and there are sensitivities around that, and so we want to work that out with our Indigenous working group and get a sense of how they want to proceed with this. In terms of the Catholic Church and other churches that were involved in residential schools, I expect that there's a federal role to play in that conversation. And again, I think that we need to continue our conversation with the Indigenous representatives to kind of chart the course for how they would like us to proceed with this. And of course, we'll bring our own ideas and views to the table as well, but we'd like to hear from them first.
Rob?
So I guess based on what I've been hearing here today, and maybe I've misinterpreted a little bit about what the role of the Indigenous Secretariat would be. So I'm getting the impression it's really more of a supportive role than it is a leadership or taking on any initiative in trying to move forward issues of Indigenous peoples in Prince Edward Island. Would that be a fair characterization of what you would describe? Because I was thinking you would take a little more initiative and a little more leadership in trying to advance their causes versus being much more supportive. I'm not saying you shouldn't be supportive, but there needs to be, I'm just sort of finding there's a bit of redundancy in the position. That's what I'm taking.
I think your characterization of us as a support function is accurate, for sure. But to go to your comment about us taking the initiative or the leadership or what have you, again, we go back to our comments that that's really not, that paternalistic approach is not what the community needs. And so we would not see the benefit in us trudging forward with ideas that we think are good, that we think are valuable, and we think what the community needs. What the community needs is time, in this specific instance around residential schools, to address their own community and intergenerational trauma. And when they're ready for our support, then we're there for them. But once again, that paternalistic approach to that relationship would only be repeating what's already been done and what's brought us to where we are today. So we are very much a support function, both to the communities and across government. And as mentioned, we are here and ready when the First Nations are.
Thanks. I appreciate the clarification of that, because I say I had somewhat of a little bit of a different interpretation of it. But in regards to, so when it comes to issues on a national scope, I guess, regarding, so does the Premier sit in on those particular meetings as the person responsible, as the minister responsible for Indigenous affairs? And once again, is he getting just representing what the Indigenous people in Prince Edward Island are requesting, or does he take any kind of a decision-making role around that table?
If there was a ministerial, federal, provincial meeting that the Premier was invited to, then of course he would attend. The role that's taken, again, goes back to what is needed, what's required, what's the topic, what's the subject. It's not for us to determine what the communities need. It is up to them to work with us, which we've demonstrated we've been doing and will continue to do.
Okay, thanks.
Rob?
That's it.
Okay. Carla?
Thank you, Chair. Going back to the TRC and one of the Recommendation 42, where they call on federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the framework for the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so on the provincial level, does the province have any timeline for doing the same? I know, sorry, I jumped ahead there. The BC government has brought this legislation in to adopt it at a provincial level. I'm wondering if there's a plan for PEI to do the same and what the timeline for that would look like.
So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is just that. It's a declaration, and it was written at a broad level because it's meant to provide a guiding principle to nation states and states around the world to guide their relationship, to ensure for safe and respectful and healthy relationships between states and Indigenous peoples, because as you know, they take very different shapes and forms around the world. So it was meant as a declaration. It actually wasn't written to be legislated. So we are following the process in BC and the process with the federal government. We've been involved in the information sharing sessions that the federal government had leading up to tabling its legislation. We got a chance to sort of hear what other PTs had to say, and they also had some Indigenous representatives at those meetings. So we continue to watch what's happening as they attempt to implement and to align all of their legislative and policy frameworks with UNDRIP. So we have an internal group that has been following this closely, having the internal dialogue, and will continue to do that. One of the things that we have to bear in mind is that while UNDRIP provides an outstanding blueprint for respectful relationships between states and First Nations, in Canada, we are one of the few countries in the world that has constitutional protection for Aboriginal rights. And so we have to think very carefully about how we engage with UNDRIP in a way that would not in any way undermine the already very robust protection that we have for Aboriginal rights.
Carla?
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. So I'm going to jump to another topic, and that is incarceration rates for members of the BIPOC community, and how they're so much higher than incarceration rates of Caucasian people. So I'm wondering, I'm curious what government is doing with that, given the different recommendations from TRC as well as from the larger discussion about it, because it's, the Indigenous people, and it's also members from our other marginalized communities. So I'm wondering, I know we are moving towards restorative justice here in PEI, and there's been a couple of examples where we moved ahead of that. I'm not sure if you would have this information, but I'm wondering if there's any what sort of positive effects that we're seeing from, I would suspect we would see those pretty quickly. So I'm just wondering if if we've seen, what kind of benefits we've seen from that so far.
So I can speak to kind of the BIPOC in general, and Helen, maybe you can speak to Indigenous justice specifically. So to your specific question about the direct results of like the new restorative justice program, we wouldn't have that information, but I know that it would be probably too soon to be able to tell. That's quite a lengthy process, but justice is a particular policy area that we are focusing on with the Anti-Racism Policy Advisor and the table specifically, and that department is engaged in ongoing and good work in that area. And then maybe I'll defer to you when it comes to Indigenous justice.
Yeah, I'm sure you're aware of the Indigenous Justice Program in PEI and the collaborative work between the Mi'kmaq Confederacy and the Justice Department, provincially and federally. And in terms, though, of tracking numbers or outcomes, I'd have to find out about that. I think that there are, sensitivities around self-identification, and I'd have to talk to the department to get that specific information for you, but I understand that the program's very successful. It's status blind, offers the programs and services to all Indigenous people in PEI.
Carla?
And I appreciate that, because, obviously, restorative justice takes into mind the intergenerational trauma that people have experienced due to the systemic racism of our systems. So, hearing that we are moving towards that, I think is crucial for the health, for the safety, for reconciliation. I know I'm jumping around a lot, but there's just so many things, and so I'm not sure this is the appropriate place to ask this, but I think it's really important because I think it was a huge oversight of government. So recently there were some accusations made in regards to the Outreach Center and the Bedford MacDonald House, where the Salvation Army there was a review done. And after the review was done, NCPEI had come out and raised issues around that they had not been consulted in this report, and that they would have been able to help government kind of find the people who had brought forward these complaints so that they could talk. I'm wondering if anything I've reached out a couple of times and haven't heard anything back. So I'm wondering if you have any knowledge into that, kind of the NCPEI, their response, and then if we're doing anything now as a result of that.
So I will add that to my Carla list of questions to follow up on.
Michelle?
Great, thanks, Chair. Okay, so I'm going to go to education. So there's a couple of recommendations in here around education at the post-secondary requirement level. So one would be to have more Aboriginal people trained in healthcare, working in positions within healthcare. And do you have any sense of a baseline of where we are currently, or 6 years ago when we probably should have been looking at this and tracking how many people we have working within the healthcare system, as to where we are now and targets in which we're trying to achieve?
So are you asking specifically about programming, like health education programming?
I'm asking how you're trying to accomplish recommendation number 23, we call on all levels of government to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field. And there's 3 principles underneath that is in Aboriginal communities and provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals. So I'm wondering if there was a baseline set as to where we were 6 years ago with the number of Aboriginal people working within healthcare, where we are currently today, and what target we're trying to achieve with the number of Aboriginal people working within healthcare.
So I think that's a challenging one. Again, it goes back to self-representation or self-declaration around individuals in the system. So to my knowledge, I don't have numbers from 6 years ago, but in terms of what the various departments are doing around cultural sensitivity training, ongoing professional development, et cetera, for healthcare professionals, that is work that we know is going on within the department today. And one of the recommendations was around the Indigenous Health Navigator, for example. It would be reasonable to assume that individual would be an Indigenous person who would then be able to provide supports to Indigenous people seeking healthcare.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. So just to kind of cover off one thing that's been kind of piquing I wanted to make the comment a number of times and find out what we're doing about it. Around record information management, there's a record retention program 101 in which every Provincial Public Service Commission employee needs to take that training. And then it is tracked as to who has taken that training, and it is reported through that department as to what the compliancy rates are. Are you doing that? Are you publicly reporting which departments are actually taking the training? And do you have a compliancy objective set out? And when those departments have to achieve that compliancy for taking these training courses?
So again, that would fall to the Public Service, Commission in terms of them tracking that onboarding and that training. And I feel it would be safe to assume that it would fall under the same policy and processes as any training. Yeah.
That with the work that we've done with the Indigenous Working Group and the offer they were very receptive to the offer to make our cultural awareness training compulsory, and so that's an initiative that the Secretariat is sort of getting into motion, and that was actually my first call was to the PSC and said, hey, there's that RIM training. We'd like to do the same thing with cultural awareness training. How can we adapt our programs so that it's the same thing, so we're tracking who's taking it? We certainly keep a list, and so does PSC, of the people that take our training. Like, we could tell you the numbers over the years, and we've seen that arc, go right up. But now we want to take that next step and make sure that it's compulsory and it's sort of an onboarding experience for new employees, and that make sure that everybody has taken it. And so we'll have to work closely with the PSC to make sure that we get those tracking systems in place.
I love that answer. Thank you
Michelle?
very much, because unless you have tangible numbers, it's really hard to hold departments accountable in order to ensure that they allow employees to have the time that they require in order to take that training and to make it a priority. And so reporting it publicly is one very successful way, if we look at the RIM training, of making that a priority within departments. And I do see that as the Secretariat's responsibility, because you do have responsibility over training, right? So if you're going to make something compulsory, making sure that it is actually being tracked is great. So appreciate that answer. Thank you. Just a follow-up on recommendation 23, if we are looking to train more people within healthcare, within education, we know that for children, to see themselves in a role, you actually have to have people in those roles in order for them to see them as role models and that kind of thing. So it's really important that we start now pushing that forward. There is a recommendation in here about providing funding for post-secondary education, and you referenced that there are 3 scholarships that are dedicated towards Indigenous youth. So I have a couple questions. Do you have numbers as to how many Indigenous youth are entering into post-secondary education at this point? And do you think that the $3,000 John J. Sark Memorial Scholarship are enough? Or do we require more to help offset the economic barriers that possibly some Indigenous youth might have in entering into post-secondary education?
So yeah, we do have the 3 scholarships, and each year, I think one of the, we could get you the numbers of how many students we've awarded them to, and it's a little bit different every year. There's always 3 available to new students or returning students. We've had different levels of uptake over the years, and we've recognized that, so we are working to try and promote the scholarship better, to get the information out to students and get them to apply. I don't know the number of post-secondary students of Indigenous students in post-secondary. That's a statistic that we could find, and I think it's really important to look at that and then look at the number of applicants that we're getting, because I think that we could get a lot more applicants, and we are aware of that, and we're in the business right now. And I'm so pleased that we've got Laurie Santange with us now, and this is the kind of work that she's doing with us, and we've already discussed this, how we can attract more students, and most certainly I think that we could look at how we can enhance that fund and perhaps expand it.
And thank you for that. Just one more, and then I'll, one more. Because I think you always need to look at goals and identify barriers that you have in order to achieve those goals. And, Peter had mentioned the budget proposal for BIPOC Usher, and they had made recommendations around post-secondary as well. So I think that there's a real opportunity there to identify, if we're going to have more people within the workforce that's represented from the communities, we have to remove the barriers of allowing them to get that education in the first place. And so we should be creative there. But to identify that, you have to work with the communities in order to identify what are their barriers, and then start actively removing those barriers, or else you're never going to accomplish your goal in the first place. So I will just ask about the advisory committee. I'm interested in engagement, because government is famous for engaging at the end, when you've already decided what you're going to do, and then put it out to the public to say, this is what we're going to do, what do you think? When basically that it's really hard to right that ship, or to make any changes there. So what have you defined what the advisory committee's role will be whenever government is bringing forward legislation, and where their input will be within that process of developing legislation, regulations, policies, etc.? Will it be at the beginning, or will it be at the end, where it's really hard to inform any decisions?
So which group are you referring to specifically? You mentioned BIPOC Usher, so are you?
The advisory committee that you had referenced as part of the actions that you have an advisory committee that you are going to be putting on to engage PEI this summer.
Table.
Yeah.
So we would see that as being part of the continuum, for sure, and that anti-racism and policy advisor position as well will be closely connected with that table. That individual, we anticipate, will be working directly on legislation, policy, and regulations, and would be working to support and be that liaison to the table. So we would anticipate that being, their engagement and participation be on the continuum of that development.
Trish?
Thank you, Chair. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about access to mental health supports for racialized islanders and permanent residents. Wondering what efforts have been made in increasing those access to supports for racialized islanders.
So in our recent discussions with BIPOC Usher, for example, that's a priority area for them. And so part of the objective of providing them with the core funding that they need is that they then become an entity that we can work closely with. The work that they do around community navigation, et cetera, also would include gathering information and data, and we would anticipate using them as a vehicle for sharing that information with us that we could then, or they can then provide directly back to the Department of Health. I think specifically when it comes to the Indigenous community as well, as I mentioned, there are mental health and addictions teams who go directly to the reserves to provide support to those individuals.
Carla, did you have the?
One more question. Many newcomers in PEI are permanent residents, and this prevents them from engaging in the democratic process. It makes it harder for them to influence policy to support racialized people in PEI. And some places have considered extending the right to vote to permanent residents, especially in municipal elections. Is this something that there's been any discussion on in government?
Not to my knowledge.
Michelle has a quick hitter.
One statement and then one quick question. We talk about having courses for people to take, but I think it's also important to have that education spread out amongst, all throughout any kind of coursework that we do, to have one course defined as this is when we're going to talk about Indigenous rights or minority rights or whatever. Just seems like we're putting it in a box and we're saying, take this and understand that. I think it needs to be threaded all throughout all of education, whenever we're onboarding, whenever we are training anybody within any system within government, that it should always be incorporated throughout all training and not just be one specific course, check the box, and it's done. So I just wanted to make that statement. I also wanted to touch on the TRC recommendation number 18, which is on health. There is a statement that says in 2019-2020, the province conducted a province-wide series of gambling focus groups to better understand gambling in Prince Edward Island. 2 of the sessions were devoted to, one with the Abbotsford First Nations and the other with Native Council of PEI. Did you have access to those reports, and is that a report that can be published publicly for all islanders to see?
I haven't had access, no.
We haven't seen those reports.
So in the compiling of this report, which I think that you were prime on, this has been identified. Can you reach out to whoever might have this report and ask for it to be made public? It was 6 focus groups, I guess, and it seems the resulting report was vetted with participant groups to ensure accuracy interpretation, so it seems like it has been completed and it's being used in a 3-year strategic plan, so it would be great to have that published. Thank you, Chair, for letting me.
Great. Yeah, and thanks a lot for your patience today. This is an important day, and this letter, when we first started this, went out to the Premier. So I think that you talked about paternal support leadership. I think it would have been nice to see him here today to talk about this, because it's important issues. These issues are incredibly important. The Premier announced last year that there will be a partnership with the Mi'kmaq Treaty Education. This is what he said. When we talked last year about having and recognizing formally Treaty Day, this is the kind of what I had in mind. It was just important to recognize our past, but also it is a springboard to where we go in the future. What is the status of this commitment?
So we met with Onaway last week actually to discuss that program and moving forward. So it's ongoing in terms of the research that's required to develop the program, as well as a mutual understanding of what the program is going to look like and when that will be unveiled.
Mm-hmm. It just seems a little bit slow, and when we talk about the new position, when we talk about the table, when we talk about different BIPOC issues, we're flashing back to a moment where there was 10,000 people on the streets of Prince Edward Island protesting for change. And here we are, and I think the action has been starting to happen, but you look at the speed of it, and it's not appropriate for our province. Other province, you look at where we are compared to what other provinces are doing, and we're falling behind. When you look at some of the decisions that are made, for example, when we consult with a group to figure out what islanders need from Nova Scotia, which is they're very capable, and take that and engage people with that, it doesn't always work. When is that finding? There's a Nova Scotia group consulting with the list of groups that you were talking about. When is their final report concluded?
We anticipate that work will conclude once the table is established. There's been a request made since by the community that those consultants continue to work with them in terms of overall implementation, and for that steering group to continue. So we're looking at that request now. Again, that request came from the community, and certainly there's a desire, if that's the need, to continue to working with those consultants.
I'm worried because that was not a request of the community at the beginning to establish that. So what I'm worried about here is that we've wasted time by not asking islanders to figure out islander solutions about the BIPOC issues. And now the table is here and it's coming, but we're 14 months out from when that request was made. We're 14 months out from when the request was made for a policy coordinator. Now we need more than just one person, and the list of things that person is going to take is unbelievable. That person will be busy, okay, and we need to do better. So I guess my point is I'm frustrated. I have watched this over the last year and stayed calm, and I appreciate your involvement and your support, but we have to figure out if this is a paternalistic approach, supportive approach, or where the leadership comes in. And I am just struggling watching all this over the last little while between all those three things. So I don't think I'll have any more questions right now, but that is where I stand. I'm watching this closely. I appreciate your work, and I think we have a lot of work to do in Prince Edward Island on these two files, and I'm glad you're both there in this position. So is everybody okay? Community okay with things right now? Okay. I want to thank you for coming in. This was very, very important, and very important day. And what we'll do is we'll take a quick break, and we will allow our guests to leave, and we'll conclude our business here. Great. Thank you. Okay, we're back, ready to move on to number 4, review of correspondence. Received correspondence from Mr. Mitchell Ellis. I think that was sent out yesterday. Is there any discussion from the committee on this message? Yeah.
I just have a question around this. Do we know if the Child and Youth Advocate has been, we probably don't have that information. That was the first question that popped into my mind.
Yeah, I don't we talked about that yesterday. Yeah. Rob, Michelle, did you?
I'll weigh in a little bit in this because he reached out to me. He is a constituent of mine, Mr. Ellis, and I have to admit, I understand the complexity of these issues, and I have put him in contact with different, the Child and Youth Advocate was one of them. He's coming back saying he can't seem to take anybody to get this issue taken seriously. From my end, I do get concerned about, what we think about the Nash Campbell inquiry and things of that nature, and there were certainly lots of revelations that came from that. I certainly do not want to be listed as the person that was the impediment of not allowing them to reach out. So, I mean, I did suggest to him that this committee might be an opportunity to reach out to us but I'm certainly not saying that what anybody might decide here on this by any means. Everybody has to take it at their own merits, but it does sound like a bit of a serious issue, and I revert back to that particular case. And although I don't know specifically who he's all reached out, he's given me the impression anyway that he has reached out to just about everybody, and I have put him in contact with ministers' contact numbers, or not, like their email addresses and things of that nature. So I don't know what to say. I believe it's a complex issue. Many things of these nature are very complex and not easily resolved, but I leave it to the committee, I guess, to decide what they might want to do with this correspondence.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Michelle?
Thanks, Chair. And I appreciate Mr. Ellis for reaching out and bringing it to our attention. And I think maybe a way to approach it is to, we asked a number of questions about child protection here as well, through the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations. And I could see asking the Child Protective Services to come in and give us an overview of what they're seeing within the Child Protection Act. And, with both an Indigenous lens on what, based on Chief Bernard's comments about Child Protective Services needing to be reviewed and improved, as well as we obviously have Islanders that have concerns as well. So I would see calling the department in to give us an overview of what they're seeing through their review and to give an update on that is a possible way to address the concerns.
Okay, great. Rob?
Might we also at least forward this to the appropriate department and ask them to basically follow up with this individual and ask for some action? Like I say, I may not know the specific actions to take, but I'll say that the comments are serious, and it's above my capability as an MLA to understand the appropriate action here, but it sounds that there's issues here. So I think at least if we know our weight of a committee has asked this group, or asked ever who the appropriate person is, and I guess we can collectively try to figure out who that is, whether it's a minister, whether it's a deputy minister, whether it's a child and youth advocate, again, to at least give us an indication that they've met with this individual and heard their case and heard their situation and what remedies might be able to do. I know there's confidentialities and we may not get to know the specifics, but at least if Mr. Ellis has had some satisfaction that his issue has been heard and issues to address it to everyone's satisfaction would be appropriate.
Thanks, Rob. Michelle?
Thanks, Chair. And just wondering, Robbie, if as the MLA, if you have reached out to Child Protective Services or any of the departments to follow up on behalf of them already?
The only thing I reached out was the minister at that time who was responsible for the child protection and asked them to take it. Like I said, I guess from my perspective, it's how far do you go with this, right? So, I mean, I'm figuring that the minister would be at least at our level, would be the appropriate person to start, and then they would divulge it or devolve it to whoever who would be the most appropriate person from there. My understanding is that Mr. Ellis has not gotten satisfaction from that recommendation that I made, so.
Carla?
Just another clarification question, Rob. I'm wondering, do you know how long it took for the department to get back to him, or did they?
Well, this was under a previous minister of social services that I reached out, so that's some time ago now. And that would have been probably close to a year ago. So this is ongoing, well, I guess August 2020.
Michelle?
Thanks, Chair. So obviously, this is a concerning situation, but I'm not sure it's a standing committee's purview to address individual circumstances. I see that as an MLA being that avenue into government and to be persistent to get that help. However, this wouldn't be the first time that we have heard of concerns, and we've heard, going through the TRC recommendations, it's loud and clear in there as well, which is why I would look at it from a broader scale. But I think to work on one individual case would, I think that we need to look at it from a broader perspective, from a standing committee, if we're to take that work.
Sure. Okay, so what we have is, again, we're trying to protect the privacy of all individuals, especially Mr. Ellis. So we wouldn't look at the case absolutely individually. So, but what we'll do is we'll send a letter, if it's okay, to the Department of Justice?
Social development and housing.
Social Development Housing, you think? Okay. Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. Is there a motion on the floor?
No.
So why are you suggesting this?
Well, that's just based on the committee's wishes. Yeah,
I haven't heard a motion.
yeah.
I don't. I just.
Okay, I'll ask a different way. What would the committee like to do?
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Well, I'll make a motion that, as certainly as part of the committee here, that we at least refer this to the appropriate department, which is, I guess, if we're agreeing that it's Social Services Department, to find out whether there's been a thorough investigation of this. If it's Justice, I'm happy to say it could be Justice, but whatever the appropriate department would be. And beyond that, I would suggest that we maybe ask Child Protection, somebody that's a representative of Child Protection, into our committee for just an overview of how these types of issues are being dealt with moving forward.
Okay.
So that's my motion.
Thanks, Ron. Carla?
And to add to that motion, to also speak more generally about the review.
That's correct.
Okay.
Perfect. Great. Did anybody else have anything to add to that? Zach?
What is the specific motion, sorry, Robin?
It's a motion to take the correspondence that Mr. Ellis had, to at least refer it to the appropriate department and receive follow-up that the issue has been looked into or dealt with. Like I say, I guess my thoughts are simply, we've got this correspondence, do we dismiss it, or do we at least see that it's gone somewhere? And so that's where I'm kind of coming from. I understand the committee's views in saying that we generally don't get into specifics in a public hearing, but we might be able to at least have it been addressed, the individual side, and then we can talk about the bigger issue of child protection issues as a committee with those that are appropriate for that too.
Great. Okay. Do you have any other questions, Zach?
No.
Okay. So can you want to read back whatever you've had said?
So there was the motion to refer the correspondence through a letter to the Department of Social Development and Housing for a follow-up on what they have done. There was two other parts to that as well. I don't know if you want to deal with them separately, but also to reach out to a representative who deals with child protection, to bring them into committee potentially, and also generally review the TRC review as well, the recommendations.
Sydney?
Could I ask that those be separated into different motions, please?
Sure. Okay, so let's vote on read the first motion back?
Yep, so
Okay,
that's
so we're gonna-
to refer this correspondence to the Department of Social Development and Housing for a follow-up.
All in favor of that motion, say aye. Those against? Nay. So there's 3 votes against, and 2 votes for. That motion doesn't pass. So number 2?
Number 2 would be to bring someone in responsible for child protection. I don't know who the committee specifically would like to bring in, but an invitation to present to committee.
Yeah. That would be motion number 2. Okay, so all in favor of that motion, say aye. Aye. Okay, any against? No? Okay, that motion passes. Yeah,
Can I just make a recommendation that we put it out to the director and any support staff that she feels she needs to bring?
yeah.
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, did you want, who did you want to bring in to discuss that more generally?
That wasn't my.
That was,
So,
I would suggest that the department would also have information on that based on what the assistant deputy ministers said today. So it would be my expectation that the same person could speak to it.
Okay, great, perfect. So that would be a third Sydney?
Discussion on the motion. Can you explain that again, Michelle? Like, is that in reference to what Robbie had brought up, or in reference to the presentation today that you're looking for more information? Like, how is that different from today, I guess, is I'm just clarifying.
Sure, thanks, Sydney. So based on the TRCs, there was recommendations around child protective services. And we understand that there's also a review of the act that is happening currently. So I would say that it is together. So based on using the information that came out of the TRC, recommendations should be informing also that review. So I would only see it as a single motion, just coming in to speak to the review of child protective services here in Prince Edward Island.
Perfect. Any other clarification questions? All in favor of that motion, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion passed. So that would be correspondence, so we will leave number 4 there. So number 5, any new business at this time? Okay, perfect. Could I get a motion to adjourn? Okay, Carla Bernard. This meeting is adjourned.